just introduce the panels with a shortened version of their bios, and the full bio will be shared in the chat room. So Miranda Levy is a journalist and author of more than 25 years experience, is now a freelance writer and editor for national newspapers covering many topics, but particularly health. Miranda has also contributed to The Spectator, the Jewish Chronicle and New York Post, as well as several literary festivals, radio and TV shows and podcasts. Miranda's self-help memoir, The Insomnia Diaries, How I Learned to Sleep Again, was published by Octopus Books in June this year. Dr. Shay Rosebert is a clinical psychologist and organisational consultant with many years' experience of working both within the NHS, charity and private sectors. Shay is the Director of External Relations for the Association of Clinical Psychologists in the UK and former Chair of the Psychosis and Complex Mental Health Faculty and member of the Division of Clinical Psychology Executive within the BPS, British Psychological Society. Zev Faith is a Jewish, mad, disabled, queer, transsexual survivor of adolescent and adult psychiatric abuse, aspiring mad scholar with an MSc in creative arts and mental health, interdisciplinary effect artist in specialising in performance, live art, automatic drawing and writing, rooted in themes of madness, disability, addiction, alienation, social justice, anti-capitalism and the psychiatric industrial complex, queer identity and emotional exhibitionism. And after surviving psychiatry's labelling and drugging, Zev now exists outside of psychiatry since 2018 and is currently tapering off duloxetine after 12 years of being polydrugged with 25 different psychiatric drugs. Dr. Anne Guy is a psychotherapist in private practice, having previously worked as a lecturer at the University of Roehampton. She's a member of the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry, which, as we mentioned earlier, is the Secretariat Coordinator for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Prescribed Drug Dependence. And she's also an associate member of the Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. She's the lead author for the Guidance for Psychological Therapists, Enabling Conversations with Clients Taking or Withdrawing from Psychiatric Drugs, created in collaboration with leading UK therapy organisations. And we've got the link for that, I think, in the chat, and I'll certainly be sending that link out afterwards. And I think we've got some more resources kind of being added to the chat room as we go along. So yeah, I'm going to thank you all, and obviously thank you Joanna and James for coming back to join the panel, and thank you all the panel members. It's great to have you all here, and I'm going to pass over to Lucy to chair the next bit. Thanks, Luce.
Thank you, Jo. So lovely to see you all, except I can't see Miranda. Is Miranda here? Miranda Levy?
We don't have Miranda as yet, so we're
okay.
Yes,
Well,
we're watching for her arrival.
You can join us as soon as she arrives.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a bit of a difficult task here. There's been about 100 questions, it seems like, and we're not going to be able to cover all of them. We will, I hope, be able to cover at least some of them. And a number of them were about what resources can I access as a survivor or as a professional, and there are links to those in the chat. So I won't be addressing those specific questions, but I'll try and cover as many others as I can, perhaps by grouping some together. And in each case, I'm going to ask anyone who has something to say about a particular question if they could do that little hand, either just wave the low-tech version or click that little thing that shows a hand. We don't have to feel obliged to have an opinion on every question. In fact, we probably won't have time for that. But if you have something you'd particularly like to say, do kind of wave at me. So fab. So Jo and I are cheating a bit because we're taking organisers' privilege and asking the first two questions ourselves. They didn't, I mean, actually a lot of similar questions did come up in the chat anyway. So this is my burning question. I'm going to ask James and Jo first and then see if anyone else has things they'd like to add. So James and Joanna have consistently argued that the roots of much of our distress lie in our social and economic context. Today it's James who focused mostly on that, but Joanna's also written a lot about that, especially the system we call neoliberalism. Why is it so hard to see this? I think probably all of us here are sitting now saying, of course, but why is it somehow so hard to see that, to make those links? Either James or Joe like to make a response to that. You'll need to unmute yourselves as well if you're going to.
Joe, would you like to go first?
I don't mind. I feel maybe it's your it's your prerogative.
Both of your bags.
Well, I'll say a few words. So, well, I think the link between distress and the social determinants of distress actually is made by the public most of the time. I think they intuitively realise that the reason they may be distressed is because of circumstances. You know, relationships are going wrong, don't like their work, things have happened to them that have hurt them, and which is why I think a lot of them are surprised when they go to a mental health professional. That mental health professional confronts them with a sort of a medicalised view of what's gone wrong and invariably prescribes drugs. And I think that the research bears that out. Research shows most people, when they consult a GP, would prefer a social or psychological intervention to a pharmaceutical or pharmacological one. So I think the public get it. I think the problem is mental health professionals, we don't get it. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I've stated one of them in my presentation. You know, our sector has morphed into a servant of neoliberalism, and it's trained mental health professionals to be emissaries of that system. So those who believe in the medical model are trained to medicalize, individualize, pathologize, depoliticize, commodify distress. That's what they do. There is a pushback against that, which is, I'll be brief, I know I've spoken a lot already. There is a pushback which you hear some psychiatrists say, well, look, we're really biopsychosocial. That's what we are, psychiatry. That's what we do. We're biopsychosocial. What does that mean? Well, in my view, what that means is that it pays theoretical lip service to the idea that distress is rooted in biological, social, and psychological factors. But in practice, what it really does is mostly prescribe psychiatric drugs. So in practice, it is not honouring the links, the obvious links between distress and social determinants. So the reason for that is the training we're subject to. I'll leave it there for now.
You want to add to that, Joanna? Welcome.
Yeah, just I really enjoyed your talk, James. It was fantastic, and I've been thinking along similar lines recently, particularly in relation to children. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was doing something on children. You know, basically, we've decimated the conditions for secure family life by getting rid of secure employment. And you know, in the middle of the 20th century, people could rely on being able to get a job. It was not difficult to get a job, and jobs were reasonably well paid, and you didn't even have to have two earners in the family to live in reasonably comfortable conditions. And that has completely changed. So we've increased the stress on family life. We've got rid of any youth clubs that ever existed where people might have had another outlet for, you know, meeting peers and having other contacts. And we've made school increasingly competitive and, you know, emphasized your individual performance and, you know, criticized people who aren't doing well and penalized failure more. And if you don't do well academically, the opportunities available to people are much, much more limited than they used to be. And to solve all those problems, we've told all these children, you know, they've got mental health problems, and we're putting them on stimulants or sending them for counseling. I mean, it is the most absurd situation. So I completely agree. The only thing I would add really is that I think, I agree with James, I think the mental health system is a servant of the state. And at the moment it's a neoliberal state. But states throughout history have made use of, or recent history anyway, have made use of, have made use of mental health concepts and mental health services to support themselves, basically to legitimize themselves and to enforce social order, to make sure that people accept their current circumstances, and to persuade people that there's no alternative. I think that's really important as well, that all this talk about us having diseases, it stops us thinking that maybe society could be different, that maybe we don't have to live in this hyper competitive, hyper stressful society. Actually, maybe it could be differently organized.
Thank you, and welcome, Miranda. So anybody else want to comment on anything to say about that first question? Zev, yes. What are your views? You'll have to unmute yourself, which you just have. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, hi. So yeah, I mean, much going on what Joanna and James just said. I think a lot of it comes from the way that the professionals are trained. They're trained to see all the stress as kind of just like a medical problem. And I think that kind of biomedical explanation is so prevalent in us in Western society, and even kind of like on the internet, just like can't go through Facebook without seeing like a meme about like not having enough serotonin or something. And yeah, and this biomedical model just like supports the status quo, and it tells us that wider society doesn't need to change since the deficit lies in the individual, and it's much easier to write a script than restructure all of society. And I think another reason that some people have difficulty linking social and economic contexts with distress is that people across this, it's not just people in poverty or in unsatisfying jobs who are struggling with distress. People all across the strata struggle with various degrees of distress, and I think a lot of people use that as an excuse to decontextualize and depoliticize distress. Like often you kind of see that thing of just like, oh, mental illness doesn't discriminate, but kind of like research shows that's not true. But still, even people who are kind of like working well-paid jobs get distressed because, again, it comes from those neoliberal values of being competitive, of materialistic consumption, of individuality, and being goal-driven and succeeding as being seen as like signs of just like good mental health. And then people are under immense pressure to fulfill and uphold these. And if you don't meet these standards, people feel inadequate, and they strive for kind of an explanation of kind of why they're struggling. And when they get that kind of biomedical explanation, their diagnosis, then they kind of have that explanation that doesn't really explain much, but then they look within themselves as for their failures rather than looking at the social structure.
Thank you. So there's an enormously powerful narrative which we're all caught up in and have imposed on us, even if it's not how we'd naturally think, and that includes even the more fortunate of us, is what people seem to be saying. And what do you want to add something to that, Anne?
Yeah, it was just noticing how much of what Mark Fisher writes speaks to me. Particularly in terms of any kind of subversive ideas kind of being pre-incorporated by capitalist culture, which makes it very hard to think about. And I think that's what you were noticing in talking about how hard it can be to make the link between what we kind of understand about how distress is caused, and yet our cultural experience of it being medicalized and these things not quite making sense. But it's hard to envisage it. It's hard to encapsulate it. And there's a brilliant Mark Fisher quote, which basically says, capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable. And that just summarizes it for me. And what James and Joanna's books do so brilliantly is to disturb this kind of self-evident truth that we are indoctrinated in, essentially we're socialized in our culture, to actually point to a different reality or some different possibilities. And that's what's so exciting about these books, is making that visible.
I think that's really important. We're expanding the boundaries of what we are permitted, allowed thing.
How we can think about this, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Anybody else want to say anything in response to that question before I pose the next one?
So I just wanted to come here with it. I agree with James. The public do get it. They do get the link between social determinants of health and distress. I agree with Joanna about how society has changed the nature of our stability and how we're contained, and what we're teaching younger generations is concerning. I agree with Zev about, I mean, psychology is as medicalized as psychiatry in lots of ways. I've got nieces studying psychology at university, and I was quite appalled at what they're being taught, you know, very much the same as what I was taught 30 odd years ago, hasn't really moved on. I think there is resistance in the profession, so there's psychologists for social change, so there is kind of resistance around. But I do think we need to think about what is the problem that the economic solution is trying to solve. And the medical model gives like an illusion of control, an illusion of what we know what we're doing. But I think there is like resistance to that. So I'm a Cub Scout leader. I believe in collectivism, and you know, within my professional life, I think we need allies. I do think we need to unite. And that political activism, so events like this are an invitation for people to join up and be allies and be groups. Someone in the chat said something about MPs and their health isn't great. There was a survey about their health, and about 50% of them, their mental health isn't great either. So yeah, but there is something about us joining in that collective action. I think, I mean, the civil rights movement started a long time ago, and you can argue how much change has actually been. It was only a couple of weeks ago that we had the first conviction of a police officer in the UK for the death of a black person in custody. You know, so some things have changed and some things haven't, and that's why it might be people get helpless and hopeless. But that's why I think we need to come together as allies in groups, in collective political action for change, to make the structural changes. That's what's important.
Thank you. I'm going to come back towards the end about what can we do, because there are quite a few questions about, well, what can we do? But certainly I think that's an important part of it. But I just want to move on to Joe's question now. Joe wanted to ask the panel, people who raise questions about the use or overuse of psychiatric drugs are often accused of pill shaming or worse. There's all sorts of pushback, isn't there, for people saying, well, anything from my drugs haven't been helpful to they've been actively unhelpful. And there are several people on the panel who've had quite long-term experience of using psychiatric drugs. How can we deal with that kind of pushback? And is that something that you've encountered? Anybody want to say something about that? James, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we hear this phrase quite a bit. I think there's a really important distinction to be drawn between disparaging and shaming someone for seeking out an intervention or taking an intervention that they feel helps them on the one hand, and on the other hand, engaging in evidence-based critique of the overselling of the safety and efficacy of, for example, psychiatric drugs. The people I know are engaged in the latter occupation, not in the former. I think we all accept that, you know, it's a courageous act to seek help. We're critical of the help offered, but we're not critical of people for seeking help and for having faith in interventions. I mean, if I may give you a quick personal anecdote here. When I was a young lad, I was in my early 20s, I went through a very difficult period, and I read Listening to Prozac by Peter Kramer. I don't know if any of you've read that book, but I was really impressed by that book. I thought that Prozac would solve all my problems. I didn't know at the time that the book was deeply misleading and misguided. I didn't have the information at hand to critically interrogate what I was reading. And I was so impressed by the book that I actually went to my GP and I asked for Prozac. And my GP said, his words were, "You don't look depressed to me, young man. Go away, sit it out, and things may shift soon." And so I followed his advice, but I still fantasize about this alternative reality where I had a different GP and I'm still taking still taking psychiatric drugs. So look, I have immense sympathy for people and their needs and they're seeking help. And I don't criticize that. We make evidence-based critiques of the model. That's what we do. We will still get called, some of us will still get called pill shamers or anti-psychiatrists, even if you're a psychiatrist doing this. I've seen that happen, or Scientologist or extremist. And I think the best policy with this is to mostly ignore it. I think if you spend your time pushing back on this, you probably have no time left for anything else. So that's my unless it's very public and you have to call it out. But most of the time, I think we should just get on with our work.
Thank you. I can see some raised hands from the attenders, but I'm only taking responses from the panels at the moment. So, Zev, did you want to add anything to that? Have you had pushback through questioning the use of drugs? I know you've had personal experience of taking psychiatric drugs as well.
Yeah, and I think in my personal experience, the concept of pill shaming, I think it stems from a very real fear around our distress being undermined or dismissed. And I think kind of, unfortunately, there are people in the world who think that our complex psychosocial struggles can be solved by just like getting on with it. And I think as a consequence that people on psychiatric drugs can face social stigma. And I think there's this kind of like push to normalize taking psychiatric drugs, but I think that's kind of the wrong way to be looking at the issue. And I think instead of normalizing taking psychiatric drugs on the scale that our society does, I think I'd rather see a society that is more understanding, accepting and accommodating of extreme states, such as outward displays of emotional distress, of unusual experiences and problematic behavior. And I think the way forward is to just gently challenge people's views. Due to like power imbalances, a lot of people have never been exposed to these critical views before, and it can be frightening and unsettling and upsetting to have people's entire belief system completely shattered, and to treat people kind of with as much compassion and kindness as we can, because an unhappy person who's experiencing social injustice might be on an SSRI after a 10-minute GP consultation is not really my enemy. That's not the person who I'm fighting against. I'm fighting against the dominant biopsychiatry ideology. And kind of, yeah, but also in my experience, I have faced far more stigma and pushback as a person who is deciding that I don't want to take psychiatric drugs, that, you know, despite the fact they basically kind of like ruined a big chunk of my life, people, when I, exhibit withdrawals, pretty intense withdrawal symptoms, people constantly say, oh, maybe just that you actually need them, or this or that and the other. So I feel far more stigmatized as someone who's going against the mainstream. I think, yeah, for people who kind of just like support the kind of mainstream chemical imbalance thing, okay, they have an entire mental health system, they have an entire kind of just like place that supports their views. I have a lot less of kind of like resources to places that support my views, which is why I'm very grateful for this space. Thank you.
I think you've made some really important points there. If you've bought this narrative, been sold it can come as a shock. I mean, someone in the chat I noticed said, I've been lied to and I'm angry. It's difficult to hear this stuff, isn't it? Particularly if you've been taking these drugs. So we need to be kind and appreciative of the position that we all come from. And I wonder, is Miranda still here? Because I know she's...
Can I say something quickly, Lucy?
Yes, please do.
In response to something Zeb said, that I think this is coming from a place that people feel that this is the only way that they can really get people to take their problems seriously and get the help they need. And this is so problematic, I think, that we need to have a disease label to offer people ordinary sensible help that that makes sense. To offer kids extra help in school, they have to have a disease label. To get a day off work, if you're in a stressful situation, you need to have a sick note from a doctor. This is, we need to acknowledge that sickness is not the only reason that people don't function, or that people might need support and care.
Is Miranda here? She temporarily vanished again.
We don't have Miranda with us at the moment, Lucy, so
Okay. So following on from that, because at all costs we have to appear balanced. Have you noticed that? Anything that sounds not balanced, which sometimes is code for I don't agree with you, it doesn't go down well. But a few people have asked in the chat, in what circumstances can drugs be helpful? And I think none of us are saying they can never be helpful. Might be useful just to clarify that a bit.
Yeah, can I respond to that, Lucy, quickly, because I saw that came up when I was talking, or just after I spoke, and I sort of didn't get round to that bit in a way because I was focusing on other things.
What's the ideal way of using drugs?
So first of all, I think it depends on the different drugs and people's different situations. There's not a single rule that can be specified. I don't agree that, you know, all psychiatric drugs are useful, or that they're all, you know, everyone who has a severe mental health problem can get some benefit. I don't think that's right. But I do think there are some situations, such as, I do think that someone who's acutely psychotic, sometimes it's useful to have some antipsychotics, not because they're curing their disease, but because they do quite effectively damp down the mental activity that's going on. And when your mental activity has been taken over by, you know, or is consumed by, you know, paranoid ideas and hallucinations, it can help to have that dampened down, and that can help people to rejoin reality. I think benzodiazepines, you know, used very sensibly, just for a night or two if people aren't sleeping or are very stressed, I think they can be helpful. If someone's having a manic episode, you know, I think there was a question about that in the chat. If someone's having a manic episode, they're essentially really, really over aroused for a long period, not sleeping. A variety of sedative drugs, I think, are appropriate in that situation to help bring someone down. They'll come down in the end, but, you know, racing around and not sleeping for weeks and sometimes months at a time is not good for people. And the use of sedative drugs in that period while they are manic, I think, is sensible, as well as looking after them and making sure they don't go and do anything silly. So those are some of the situations in which I think drugs can be helpful. I'm less clear that any drugs are helpful if someone is depressed. I'm just not sure that, you know, I think depression is a clue that something's wrong in our lives, and we need to look and understand what it is and try and change it, or try and get together with other people who can help us change it. I don't think that taking something that just blanks it out is usually very useful.
Thank you. That's a good summary. Anybody want to add to that about times when drugs can be useful?
Can I just come in there as well? Just thinking about the experience I've had working with people. I think it's so easy just saying how we even speak about medicines, how institutionalized we can become, and talking about it from a symptom kind of perspective. And I think we need to think about people in their context. I think we need to think about relationship building and having trust and understanding, you know, what works for people, so that we're not coming across as either patronizing or telling people what to do, but actually we're getting to know people, and we're seeing medicines as an option, because for some people they are very helpful and life-saving, and for some people they're not. But I think for me it starts with the relationship building, and for me, around the accusations of pill shaming, for me it's actually about informed consent. It's about equality, it's about equity, it's about understanding, you know, why are some people offered medicines at a time of crisis. So I'm thinking about Black men when they're in the inpatient unit, whereas there's been things happening for people maybe for weeks, months, years, where they didn't need to even get to that point. You know, why are women prescribed antidepressants more? So for me, it's about choice and control and shared kind of understandings, and medicines being part of a range of options, but people understanding what the medicines are doing. Are they arousing their system? Are they sedating their system? Because essentially it's those two things that are going on, and let people have control of that.
Well, I hope we could all agree about informed consent as a principle, and something you said, Shay, is linked to a question that someone else has asked actually. And this is a kind of broader question, thinking about the way particular groups are targeted and overdiagnosed and medicalised. Somebody asked if there was a comment about the overdiagnosis and overmedication and overmedicalisation generally of Black Americans as a mechanism of systemic racism and capitalism. So that's touching on a very big subject. Would you like to comment further on that?
Just that it is a political action to kind of, you know, there are certain groups in society that are treated differently, and that's political and that's discriminatory. And we know that. Yeah. But when we don't have structural ways, so in this country, when we had a mandate to actually collect the data on race and medication, the overprescribing of antipsychotics actually went down. But then the mandate went, and then it became more of a postcode lottery of which services actually still paid attention to that or not. So you do need structural, there are some targets that are good and some targets that are not good. And we need information, and knowledge is power. So we do need to know the information transparently about what's going on in services, and making best use of that information, co-produced with communities, not just people that are in receipt of services, but with whole communities, to make use of that data. So hang on a minute, why is this happening? What are other solutions? But if you're not asked to collect that data, a lot of people don't.
So we're getting some ideas, some practical ideas about what could be different, of which knowing the situation has to be the first, doesn't it? Anybody else want to comment on that? I mean, it's obviously tied in with all the other ways in which neoliberal agendas oppress particular groups. Zev, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think kind of just touching back kind of on informed consent. I don't and when is the appropriate time for someone to take a psychiatric drug or any other drug. I think that anyone who kind of who's had an honest conversation with their doctor, who's been informed of the intended effect that the drug is supposed to have, how the drug works, even though we kind of don't necessarily know that, the risks, the potential side effects, and the doctor has kind of thoroughly warned the person about the kind of complications of psychiatric drug withdrawal, including the kind of 50% plus chance of kind of that the person could suffer disabling mental and physical problems lasting months or even years. And if someone consents to, after hearing all that information, if someone still consents to that, I think Howard, and they, Howard to them. I know there's been, I mean, I'm also just like a recovering drug addict, of illicit drugs, and I think sometimes using that kind of just was how I kind of just survived a lot of just adverse and difficult life situations, and maybe kind of, and while it had just extreme consequences on my life, that it also kind of just kept me alive when it did. So I think personal choice, rather than kind of just maybe other people kind of being the arbitrator of kind of just what is severe and what is kind of mild, and kind of just I think free choice is kind of the most important, and yeah, informed choice is.
Thank you. Just following up on the drug theme just for a minute, then I want to broaden out a bit some of the other questions. But a number of people ask, how can we get this information about drugs into training courses and get doctors to it and so on? And I'm going to give you a little chance, Anne, to plug the recent report that you were involved in, not just you, but James and various other people, which is a report encouraging psychological therapists to have awareness of the possible pros and cons of psychiatric drugs in their clients. I think the link's been put in the chat. Do you want to just mention that?
Yeah. So we published this guidance for therapists, which Joanna contributed all of the section around summarising the impacts of drugs, what they do, how they're thought to work, how they actually work, how they might impact therapy. And James also wrote the introduction to it. Shay was part of it, of actually the steering group for the report. And we summarise in there how you actually might help somebody who's trying to withdraw from prescribed drugs. And that information is actually potentially relevant to not only to psychological therapists, but to anybody who's working with somebody who might be coming off prescribed drugs. So we're also doing some work. We're looking at ways that we might be able to get information into all sorts of training programs, not only for therapists, because actually for therapists, a lot of it at the time is if somebody's withdrawing from prescribed drugs, we kind of need to stop what we're doing, because this isn't about ascribing psychological reactions to the individual. It's recognizing that it's the drug that's actually creating effects. So actually a lot of the time we're trying to get out of the way of the process of withdrawal and just supporting somebody with coping with that process. So it's so important, which is the whole theme here, that it's not the individual, it's the drug or it's the system that needs attention. So the guidance for therapists, I think, is a good start, but we recognize how far we need to get into GPs. There's also been some interesting discussions being held even with the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Joanna, may want to say something about this. At one of their recent conferences, they were actually having discussion panels about deprescribing. And it's very encouraging that the latest version of the Maudsley prescribing guidelines now actually includes information about deprescribing, written by Dr. Mark Horowitz, one of Joe's very close colleagues. So more and more information is getting out there, but it is a slow process. There is no doubt about that. I also sit on the advisory group for the NHS project, which is looking how to implement recommendations from the PHE report into prescribed medicines. And my goodness, it's slow, and I wish I could report something more positive in terms of how soon services are likely to be in place. They're writing a commissioning framework, which will be published in April next year, basically saying to CCGs or the new integrated care systems that they should be commissioning services for people who are dependent on prescribed drugs and trying to withdraw. But PHE told them this in 2013 and nothing really has happened. So without ring-fenced funding, it's hard to see how there's going to be much impetus to actually create these services. So James and I work as part of the Secretariat supporting the APPG for prescribed drug dependence, and we are working politically to see if we can do anything to try and get some ring-fenced funding to set up a national helpline at least. Information is so key, just backing up what Shay was saying. Without information, really having that hard and fast evidence about how many people are actually going through this. I mean, there's a lot of evidence already, but collecting it unfortunately, in our neoliberal structures, we need to collect it in prescribed ways and present it in prescribed ways in order for the system to react to it. That will be a huge thing if we can get a helpline going just for that purpose alone.
I mean, it's fabulous. I mean, thanks to a great deal of pushing, I know, a great deal of pushing, maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but things do seem to be changing slowly, don't they? So,
yeah, it slowly is, unfortunately.
Well done to all involved. So, slightly broaden the discussion out again. Somebody's asked an interesting question. This comes up quite a lot, actually. Is there a risk of helping the neoliberal agenda and supporting, in effect, its cuts to support by criticising the mental health system? I often get asked that. So is that a risk? Is that an unintended side effect of saying, questioning the idea that there are mental illnesses, that drugs could be helpful, etc., etc.? Any thoughts about that? James, what do you want to say to that?
Yeah, I would say it absolutely is a risk. It's a time when the government is chomping at the bit to cut everything and anything, to give them an argument as to why they should cut mental health services because they're rubbish or they're failing or the outcomes of it improved, is a temptation, isn't it not, for someone trying to save money? So I think there is a danger there. On the other hand, I think you have to offset that against the real public need for some kind of support and provision, and the evident outcry that will be generated as a consequence of that kind of action. So I don't think any politician would want to be seen as the one who cut mental health services. It wouldn't be a popular move, and so the ego of politicians hopefully will safeguard our services.
I'm glad politicians' egos have some purposes.
Yeah, but I'm more hopeful that when government really gets its head around the extent to which our services are an utter waste. I mean, if you're a true neoliberal, you look at the spreadsheet, don't you? You say, look, how much have we put in to this service, and how much are we getting out of it? And when you look at the figures, it's woeful what you're getting out of it, actually, given how much has been put in, historically speaking. And also given how much potential waste there is in the system over unnecessary prescribing is costing. We're doing some research on this at the moment, looking at this. And we're looking at figures that are incredibly high that are being incurred as a consequence of unnecessary prescribing of dependency-forming drugs. Money that could be reinvested in non-medical alternatives, which is what people are crying out for. So I'm hoping, rather than these arguments leading to yet more cuts to services, which I will agree is possible, I'm hoping it will lead towards a reconfiguration of services towards privileging interventions, which hopefully will yield better outcomes than what we've seen. I mean, this approach has had a few decades to prove itself, and you know, and it's not delivered. We've got to start doing things differently.
What do other people think? Are they concerned about this possible? I mean, I've heard Sami Tamimi say very bluntly, we don't want more of the same. I wonder if he was here, he might actually say, actually, it wouldn't be such a terrible thing if many services in their current form disappeared, but then you're left with many people in severe distress. So I think it's a real conundrum, actually.
I mean, what I'd say to that is we're not saying that people aren't distressed. People are distressed. We're saying divert the resources into changing the causes of distress. We're saying treat mental health as a public health issue. Again, having the range of options from the political to structural to the social to cultural to the spiritual, and have them community based. So we're not saying people aren't distressed, but we're saying stop making people distressed.
Yeah, but
essentially what we're saying.
Stop making such profits out of their distress, among other things. Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. Yeah, what did you want to add, Zev? You need to.
Yeah, I'm going to be slightly controversial and kind of say, just like, I'm all kind of for defunding the current kind of just like mental health services and re-diverting those funds into more community-based peer support resources. If I'd never been through the mental health system, I would be in a far better just like place now. It cost the government for, to put me kind of just like in a 6-month hold in a psychiatric institution when I was 15, that cost like £200,000. That would be enough to kind of just like, give me a house, which unstable housing has basically been 60% of my kind of just like mental distress in the past few years. So I think, I'm not an economist, so I also just like, I'm probably not the best person to speak on this, but just like, I'm going to be kind of just like reactionary and say, abolish psychiatry, good.
Let's have a few controversial views out there. Why not? That, I mean, raises the question how, doesn't it? But and that relates to another question that was asked, which was, how would you treat the things we call bipolar and psychosis without the things we call antipsychotics? Any thoughts about that? Joanna, you often get asked that, I'm sure. What do you say to that? I mean, I guess you'd say.
Well, I think we need to
about drugs, but if you did.
I think we need to recognise that there's an important role for looking after people and keeping people safe. And, when people are really disturbed and distressed, it may not be possible to actually really talk to someone or to do any sort of meaningful therapy, but it is possible to make sure they are safe and to express some human warmth to them. And people come out of an episode of mania. Most people will come out of an episode of psychosis. People get over depression on their own. So rather than filling them full of drugs or giving them ECT or all these things that potentially damage them, why not look after them until they get better on their own? I think that's, as I said, I think there are some situations where temporary drug treatment is useful as well, but but we also need to recognize that people can get better, and there's a role for looking after them while they get better on their own.
I very much, I mean, all of these conditions, horribly distressing as they can be, are self-limiting, aren't they? And a lot of the evidence on drugs, as you know better than I do, is that it actually perpetuates things which would otherwise have reached an end at some point. But it's not to say that people don't need care and support. Of course they do. So this is a question, this might be a sort of final question. We all want to make some comments about it. It's to James and Joanna, but I thought I'd extend it to all of you. How do James and Joanna console, and the rest of the panel, console themselves in this cold, harsh, uncaring neoliberal world? So, you know, we've actually mentioned some things that I think should console us, that there are some signs of change, there are some signs of challenge, there are some signs of people doing things differently, there are possible alternatives, but would anybody want to add their thoughts to that rather challenging question? Seems particularly relevant at the moment, actually, doesn't it? The world doesn't feel in a good space, particularly from the point of view of UK citizens, I would say.
One thing to say quickly, I think reading history is always consoling. You know, we are seeing the neoliberal state trying to roll back on its obligations, but we do still have a welfare state. We are still in a very, very much better position than we were 100 years ago, certainly than 150 years ago. And we've also seen even more progress that's been rolled back, but we've seen it, therefore we know that we can do it. So I think, you know, I think that's consoling for me anyway.
Good. Yeah.
I read this book by Kotz. It was published by Harvard University Press, called The Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism. And I thought that was a really good piece of therapy for me, because fantastic book, I highly recommend it. He looks at the rise and fall of economic paradigms over a period of 200 years and concludes neoliberalism will end, because they always end. Every paradigm ends. So you can either subscribe to that view, which I think plausible if history is a valid guide. I would also say I'm consoled by people, because people aren't systems. The systems can be broken and corrupt and appalling, but people generally aren't. You know, most of the people want the best. They want their mental health professionals as well. I'm a real critic of mental health professionals, but I've met loads of lovely psychiatrists who genuinely want a better set of circumstances for people. And I meet wonderful service users. I mean, Zeb, you're a perfect example, you know, of your experience at 15 and what you went through. And here you are, you know, articulate, capable, competent, confident, calling for change. These are inspiring things to see. People who have been harmed by the system, you know, standing up and calling for change. And don't underestimate the power of people who've been through the system and stand up and speak articulately against they often know better than most of us what's wrong with it. And I think they're really inspiring. And to see that community becoming ever more emboldened and empowered. And I've seen that, I mean, I haven't been around for that long, but in the last sort of, I suppose I've been in the mental health sector as a professional for about 20 years. I've seen a rapid change in that respect, and that gives me a lot of hope. And it also gives me a lot of hope that I've seen a lot more open-mindedness in mental health professionals across a whole host of different approaches. So systems are still broken and problematic, but people are changing. And I think that's a cause for consolation.
I know you have to slip off in a minute, James, so if you need to go, then do, but thank you. We are final question. So Zev, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, for me, just like one thing that I've turned to kind of just like recently is kind of just like religion and kind of spirituality, as it just like offers me just like alternate understandings, community of mental distress. And also I'm kind of, yeah, I would like to just like mention this, I'm in the process of kind of just like starting up a group for people who've been harmed by psychiatry or psychiatric drugs, like a creative peer support group, and just so we can kind of just like get together, make some art, and just like make some political art, and yeah, just like and get together, share our experiences, strength and hope, and just like, yeah, support each other. And yeah, just Yes, I turn to creativity, spirituality, and kind of just like, and groups like kind of just like a disorder for everyone, drop this disorder, where I kind of just like can all kind of like come together and just like get angry together and fight for change. And also just nice things like kind of like spending time in nature and realizing, yeah, there is hope. There is hope.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, I think what consoles me really is the efforts that are going on around the world on this is just so inspiring. When I'm part of the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, along with others here, and we hear about so many programs and efforts that are happening in lots of different countries. And there's, is it, James, you'll remember whether it's is it Denmark or Norway? One of them has actually set up a government-sponsored program for non-drug option.
Norway. Yes, Norway.
Norway, thank you, for non-drug response to mental distress. And that just gives me such hope, the fact that there can be government-sponsored programs for this kind of thing that we can learn from, and there is evidence out there of how these things can work, and the number of grassroots programs that are going on, and the spread of open dialogue across so many different countries. There's so many different programs where it's this evidence of a groundswell of change. How far that's possible given the prevailing economic and political environment is unclear, and that's kind of a bit depressing, you know, in reading some of this and realizing that. But I would, if I may, just read another Mark Fisher quote, which I love, which is that the tiniest event can tear a hole in the grey curtain which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist reform, capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. And, you know, with this kind of event that we're running here, maybe this kind of event is that tiny event which starts to tear that grey curtain, you know.
Fabulous. And Shay, what do you want to add?
Yeah, so in terms of the revolution, I think more about what nourishes me rather than using the word console. And very much like James, I'm sustained by relationships and being creative and sort of curious and hearing stories. I'm really interested in how we're going to get a human rights approach into services, not just mental health services, but all services, and psychologically informed environments and trauma-informed ways of working. You know, the borough where I live in Tower Hamlets, the mayor has decided we're going to be a trauma-informed borough. Scotland is a trauma-informed nation. You know, so so that sustains me. You know, in England, there's a transformation work that's going on. There's also much more of a recognition that it's not them and us when it comes to mental health professionals or any professional and service users and carers. There's a lot more recognition of that, a lot more true co-production going on. So there's a lot that sustains me and makes me feel hopeful and nourished.
It's so nice to end on a positive note, and we haven't quite finished the afternoon. We're going to listen to a very, very powerful spoken word poem in just a minute. But thank you, fabulous panel. Thank you so much. Please express your appreciation to the panel in the chat. Thank you all for being here. And, you know, I'm very pleased that you think that these events are part of the change we need to see, because that's what we want them to be. So hope to see you all at future events. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to the panel, and thank you, Lucy, for very smooth moderation and facilitation there. Okay.
Right, can I just reiterate the thanks to the panel? Fantastic discussion. So yeah, thank you all for joining us today. It was brilliant. I know always it's unfortunate that we can't fit in more questions. There were so many more questions, but Lucy, you did a really good job of getting as many as possible heard. So thanks for that.